So there was a military intervention in Venezuela that has really not changed much the plight of migrants from Venezuela who are living all over Latin America, but especially in the United States, where the Trump administration's crackdown, in particular targeting of Venezuelan migrants, continues. In Mexico, there has been a lot of interesting reports coming out about smuggling trends, about the situation of non-Mexican migrants who remain stranded in the country since the shutdown of asylum access in the United States. A bunch of news about border barriers, including the installation of buoys in the Rio Grande and border wall falls and some environmental concerns. But that's what's in the January 9th, 2026 WOLA border update, which I have drafted. I am Adam Isaacson. I'm recording this from a hotel room in El Paso. I'm here for some meetings along the border. And I managed to crank out another edition of what is now our bi-weekly series of border updates. And this one talks about the issues that I just mentioned. Let's dig in a little deeper. But before I do, I should make a pitch here. I mean, I'm sort of just making these videos on the fly in a hotel room on my own, trying to get them up as fast as possible. If you find this and all of our other products useful at WOLA, please do go to wola.org and click on donate. We could use the resources to make this more of a professional operation, to have folks helping us out with it, to have more assistants, more researchers, more experts. We need to grow. It's a crucial time. So let's dig in. Venezuela. Early in the morning, U.S. troops, in a very orchestrated operation, went into Venezuela and extracted the dictator Nicolas Maduro and his wife, but leaving in place really the rest of the Maduro government. The people who have power in Venezuela, other than Maduro and his wife, remain in power now, although much more sort of under the dominion of the Trump administration. That does not mean that freedom has broken out in Venezuela and that the country is safe for migrants to return to. In fact, there has been news of some crackdowns and further repression happening. Venezuelan migrants, it's a country of maybe 28 million people inside the country. 8 million more have left the country, fled in the last 10 or 11 years or so. About 6.9 million are living elsewhere in Latin America, but more than 800,000 came to the U.S. Mexico border and entered CBP custody between 2020 and now. Most of them are still inside. Although the Trump administration has deported 17,000 of them back to Venezuela by air. That is a huge diaspora, and you're not seeing any real movement to go back to Venezuela yet. Meanwhile, inside the United States, the Trump administration has not let up, and any of the severe measures that it has already imposed on the Venezuelan population who are here in the United States. The cancellation of temporary protected status, which is leaving about 600,000 Venezuelan citizens in limbo here in the United States. The Supreme Court has allowed the TPS termination to proceed while lower courts consider challenges. The cancellation of the 2-year humanitarian parole status that the Biden administration had given to citizens of Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, that's still in place. A freeze in considering ongoing asylum cases of citizens of Venezuela and 18 other countries. The Trump administration imposed that freeze after the National Guard shooting incident just before Thanksgiving, in November of last year. Venezuelans are included among nationalities subject to a travel ban, prohibiting the entry or issuance of visas to citizens from 39 countries right now. In this list, we of course have to add the Trump administration's efforts to invoke the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelans without due process. That was on all allegations of links to the Tren de Aragua criminal group. But, if there actually if things go south in Venezuela and U.S. Military personnel see themselves involved in hostilities in Venezuela, well, we could easily see White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller saying, hey, we're at war with Venezuela, and therefore we have to apply the Alien Enemies Act against Venezuelans in the United States more broadly. That's a nightmare scenario, but it's something we have to keep in mind. Meanwhile, at the Department of Homeland Security, DHS Secretary Noem said, Venezuela is more free today than it was yesterday. She said that the day after the military operation. And the DHS Twitter account said that Venezuelans who have lost temporary protected status can now go home to a country that they love. There is no indication that conditions in Venezuela have improved to the point where it's possible to return to the country, economic, security, human rights, or otherwise. Noam also indicated that if Venezuelans do return, they can apply for refugee status in the United States, which there's no embassy or consular presence in Venezuela. And right now, the U.S. refugee admissions program has almost completely shut down. So far, we're not seeing indications that Venezuelans are leaving Venezuela in response to the Maduro operation. The border crossings with Colombia have been relatively quiet. Just a few notes on Mexico. There's a pretty interesting article from the folks at Insight Crime who were looking at trends in migration in the past year since the Trump administration's shutdown of access to asylum has caused migration at the border to decline so much. Smugglers are making a lot less money. The quote here, smuggling services have become more sophisticated in order to evade heightened surveillance and may include air travel, forged documents, or routes that are less visible and more dangerous. Citing a journalist in Tijuana who said that the cost to cross from Tijuana used to be around $8,000 to pay a smuggler, but now it can be $20,000 to cross to the desert or $30,000 to travel via the ocean. The Catholic diocese in Tapachula, Mexico's southern borders of the city near the Guatemala border, says that there are settlements still growing and popping up of stranded migrants, mainly from Haiti, Cuba, Venezuela, Guatemala, and El Salvador. The FA News Service noted that Mexico's refugee agency, Comar, received 52,000 asylum requests in 2025. About two-thirds of them are in Chiapas and elsewhere in Mexico's southernmost state. That's the fewest Comar asylum requests in Mexico since 2018. So many fewer people are coming up from the south. Actually, 2020 was lost because of the pandemic, but otherwise that's it. But yeah, so few people are coming that the Mexican government even closed a shelter that it had set up in Chiapas for unaccompanied adolescent migrant kids. An interesting report from Terrence McCoy of the Washington Post visited Playa Baghdad, which is the easternmost part of Mexico's border, right on the Gulf of Mexico, a fishing village that is just a few miles away from where Elon Musk's SpaceX corporation launches test rockets. And there's been so many booms and explosions and things falling from the sky that their fishing economy is pretty devastated. And a lot of the fishermen, when they stray into U.S. territorial waters, the Trump administration, if they find them, is throwing the book at them and putting them in prison for months. Interesting article in the Washington Post. The Mexican government said that their northern border operation that they declared last February after President Trump threatened to levy tariffs on Mexico is still operational in northern border states, claiming to have arrested more than 10,000 people associated with crime and to have interdicted more than 7,000 firearms coming from the United States. A few notes here about border barriers, which of course the Trump administration, thanks to the big, beautiful bill from last year, has $46 billion to use to build border barriers. DHS Secretary Noam was in Brownsville, the easternmost city in the U.S. Mexico border, right on the Rio Grande in Texas, on January 7th, and she was showing off some buoy barriers that the Trump administration is going to be installing in the middle of the river, spending $96 million for the first 17 miles in Brownsville, a place where actually the river is quite navigable. The pictures that we've seen show a long row of bright orange, tall cylinders floating in the water. And they're going to be the first of about 500 miles of this built, mostly in Texas. These buoys are different than the ones that Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, installed for about 1,000 feet in the river by Eagle Pass. Those were like spheres interspersed with serrated metal discs. No serrated metal discs this time, just big cylinders. The city of San Diego, California is suing the Homeland Security and Defense Departments because Marines have been laying concertina wire on city property in an area that is an environmental site called Madron Valley. They're suing to get them to stop putting down this concertina wire. It seems that there may be some overlap or abutment of the city property and the part of the border, sort of this 60-foot long fringe along 5 different areas of the border that the Trump administration has decided are national defense areas. That's the term they're using, and they're considering them to be extensions of nearby military bases. As a result, U.S. soldiers and guards people have been detaining migrants at least until Border Patrol can come pick them up. And apparently that's happened 3,000 times border wide so far in these national defense areas. And of course, a lot of the migrants who are being detained, whether by soldiers or Border Patrol, not only are being prosecuted for illegal entry, but they're being prosecuted for trespassing on a U.S. military installation. The U.S. Embassy in Mexico City posted a tweet on Christmas Day that read, "More than 400 people fell while trying to climb the border wall in 2025. Don't even try it." 400 border wall falls is quite a statistic. And it didn't say how many people were killed or gravely injured as a result, but some of them certainly were. A coalition of environmental groups in Arizona submitted detailed comment to CBP objecting to their plan to build 222 miles of border barriers and similar infrastructure on the southern edge of Arizona, say that the project threatens one of the most biologically rich and culturally significant regions in North America, a desert that does have rivers and springs going through it and has a lot of wildlife that has migrated, including jaguars occasionally, that migrate north to south and will be unable to do so. The statement points out that no other society before has attempted to wall off an entire continent from ocean to ocean, which is also true, but awfully remarkable. Now, the statement calls, they realize that they're not going to be able to stop this wall construction from happening, but they're urging that the design include passages for wildlife to go through, less intense lighting at night in key areas so that wildlife won't be disrupted by what is basically stadium-style lighting along the border, as well as floodgates to manage cross-border flows of streams and rivers. Just a few things in the sort of the other news category. 8 sources told Austin Public Radio in Texas that since early November of 2025, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which takes unaccompanied children who have entered Border Patrol or CBP custody, they take those children, they shelter them until they can be dropped off to sponsors in the United States, where by law, they can, if they're not from Mexico, they can begin asylum processes. The ORR apparently since early November has stopped almost all handoffs to sponsors. There was apparently a verbal order that this happen, and it's very, very few kids are now getting out of these shelters. The stay in these shelters is now stretching for many months. I think that the idea here is that they can just get kids to give up on their claims and agree to be deported. In order to facilitate that, a large portion of the children are being kept in South Texas. Politico had a good article about how the Trump administration is seeking to rely on safe third country agreements and other third country deportations in order to close people's asylum cases and send them there. And there was a decision in October by the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is part of the immigration court system in the Department of Justice, many of whose members have been switched out and replaced with more Trump-friendly adjudicators. They decided in October that, quote, judges should weigh third country removal before an asylum case is considered in the United States. So make that the possibility of a third country removal something to consider before even granting asylum in the United States. Panamanian authorities say that 3,091 people went through the Darien Gap during the calendar year of 2025. That is 99% less than the total in 2022, and then in 2023 and in 2024. People are just not coming because they know it's going to be impossible to apply for asylum or other protection in the United States, since the Trump administration has suspended that with a proclamation that remains under consideration in the U.S. courts with no decision made yet. Through November, the nationalities that were most frequently passing through the Darien Gap were Venezuela, Colombia, Nepal, Cameroon, and Ecuador. The Catholic publication Crux had an interesting article where they had done some follow-up on, you may recall in February of 2025, the Trump administration sent 2 plane loads of people from other continents to Panama with the idea, these 299 people, with the idea that they would then be sent back to their home countries from there. But at least 120 of them said, no, we fear going back. What would happen to us if you sent us back? We were fleeing persecution. And so they were not sent to their home countries. It seems that some tried to come back to the United States, and some of those actually got detained and then deported back to their home countries anyway. But there are at least 15, maybe more, but at least 15, according to Crux, who remain in Panama City, being assisted mainly by church-related shelters, but are also just getting jobs and finding a way to start new lives in Panama. Only a couple of them have actually gotten formal asylum in Panama. So why don't I leave it there? There is much more in the border update, more links to other news and concerns. I encourage you to read the written version of the January 9th border update, which also includes links to some things happening in the U.S. interior, like the horrific ICE shooting of a woman in a car in Minneapolis that happened this week, as well as a lot of analyses of the decision making happening within the Trump administration and where power lies, particularly the role of Stephen Miller. But I'll leave it there. I encourage you to visit the border update itself, give it a skim, give it a read, follow the links, and we will keep putting them out every 2 weeks for the rest of the year because we cannot lose sight, even as much else happens, we cannot lose sight of the urgent human rights questions surrounding what is happening at the U.S. Mexico border and with region wide migration. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks.